Murdered, a podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered, a podcast, we're covering a case that completely shocked a nation. It made everyone think twice about who their neighbor might be and what secrets might lie behind your neighbor's front doorstep. This week, we're starting a multi-part series about the Cleveland 3 victims, Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus. This case is about 3 different girls and young women being held against their will in a literal house of horrors for more than a decade. This is a super, super brutal case, and every possible trigger warning that you could think of, you need to go ahead and put it in here right now. I know I don't normally even give trigger warnings, but this one needs any and all that you can imagine. Also, our little tiny special guest baby is still here, so if you hear that, please ignore it. And I know that this case has been covered over and over and over again, but I still think these cases are important to cover because I don't know about y'all, but these are the types of cases that always give me hope for the people that have been missing for a while. And they always make me think twice about the people that I pass while I'm out in public every day. This case is also a good reminder that no matter how bad you think things are, that they can always get worse and that you still have to come out swinging on the other side. So before I say let's get it, let me do a little housekeeping. We've had a new Patreon member this month, so let me give a quick shout out to Michelle because thank you, girl. I'm so excited to put out the bonus episode for this month. It'll probably be out at the beginning of next week, so be on the lookout for that. I was thinking I would be able to get it out this week, but with the hurricane, they've already called school off for tomorrow. That's not happening. Let's be realistic here. If you'd like to become a member of the Mama Murdered, a podcast Patreon family, the link to join the Patreon family will be listed in the description below. There are free goodies, extra bonus episodes, ad-free episodes, and of course other perks that come along with joining because obviously. The last thing I need to say is that if you haven't already, go get your Mama Murdered, a podcast merch because the shirts are incredible. Come on, man. They're buttery soft, super... I swear this kid's waiting on me to talk. The shirts are buttery soft, super comfortable, and incredibly detailed. The tumblers actually keep hot drinks hot and cold drinks cold literally all day long. We also have hats and stickers in multiple color options. And we've made sure that everything is size inclusive. That way we can offer something to anybody that wants it. The link for the merch will also be listed down below. And I also wanted to give a shout out to Bill Selby, who's the co-host of Crimes, Killers, Cults, and Beer, which is another true crime podcast that I would highly suggest you check out. I said that Bill Selby made the music, but I completely forgot to mention that he has a podcast that you should listen to. So with all that being said, and without further ado, let's get it. So let's start somewhere close to the beginning. Michelle Knight was born on April 23rd of 1981, and literally anything that you can possibly imagine that would be traumatic for a young child to their mental health or their physical health. If you can imagine it, it basically happened to Michelle as a child. She was dealt a really rough hand straight from the jump. Michelle was born into a family with very limited money, and during an interview that I watched, Michelle said that when her family did have a home, that they didn't even have so much as a couch to sit on. And then at the sweet, innocent age of 5, a male relative of Michelle's began sexually abusing her. Michelle, to my knowledge, has still never named this male relative that was sexually abusing her from such a young age. At one point, Michelle had even lived in a station wagon with her parents and her twin brothers, Eddie and Freddie, for over a year at one point during her childhood. So, 5 people living in a station wagon for over a year together, that seems damn near impossible to most of us. But the family tried to make the best of a shitty situation. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that one of Michelle's cousins also lived in that station wagon with the family also. So, probably more like 6 people in this one car for over a year. That seems like pretty harsh living conditions on its own, but the living in the station wagon and being sexually abused by a grown-ass male family member seems like more than what one kid can handle, But that wasn't even all that Michelle was having to deal with either. The family rarely had food, and when they did have food, they never had enough for everyone in the family to actually get full. Everyone in the family only got to shower and brush their teeth once in a while, like very rarely, and when they did find somewhere to do so, Michelle, even at such a young age, was sacrificing things that she needed in order to make sure that her younger twin brothers had what they needed. Michelle would often skip meals or split her meals up between her younger twin brothers, Eddie and Freddie, so that they would have more to eat. And that was no different when the family finally got to shower and brush their teeth and their hair either. When Michelle's family would finally find a place to shower and clean up at, she would always make sure to get her younger twin brothers cleaned up and scrubbed up good before she ever even worried about showering herself, brushing her own teeth, or getting herself cleaned up. Michelle says that when everyone would get to shower, that she would make sure that her younger twin brothers were cleaned and scrubbed really good, and that their teeth were brushed and their hair was combed, because they never knew when they might get to shower and clean up again. They never knew when the next shower would be. So she was always worried about everyone else and what they needed, and not at all worried about what she needed. And she had been doing this from such an early age that I feel like it was probably just second nature to her. It probably wasn't even something that she really had to think about doing. She just automatically sacrificed whatever she needed to make sure that everybody else had what they needed. Michelle says that the places that the family did call home, for whatever short amount of time they got to stay in one place for, that they were always dirty and unkempt, unsafe, and always littered with crimes and drugs. Growing up, Michelle never lived in a place where she would think throughout the day like, oh, I just can't wait to go home. These places that the family lived weren't homey, they didn't feel safe, and it wasn't somewhere filled with love and acceptance and encouragement. Michelle would later go on to tell ABC News that her family oftentimes didn't have a stove, a couch, and that oftentimes she would cook meals on a small space heater. The kind of small space heater that just kind of plugs into the wall. Michelle even later recalled that it would take about 4 hours to cook a hot dog on a space heater. Like, she cooked so many meals on it, she knew how long each meal would take on a space heater to cook. For this hot dog to be cooked and warmed all the way through, she said about 4 hours, which is insane. Michelle later says in her book, Finding Me, which I'll link below because it's a great book, super in-depth, heavy on the small details and facts without being boring and losing your interest. I use this book for so much of my research. But Michelle later says in her book, Finding Me, that her family moved so often that she would guess that they moved about every 2 to 3 months. Her parents, herself, her 2 younger twin brothers, and whoever else was like couch surfing and crashing with them at the time, they moved every couple of months. Michelle also said that by the time that she was 11 years old, the sexual abuse and assaults were becoming more frequent, and that her abuser didn't seem to care or be bothered by where the sexual assaults happened. He didn't seem to care who was around or where he assaulted her at. Basically, anywhere that he could get Michelle alone and where no one else would be around, that's really all he cared about. And these sexual assaults, rapes, and abuse were happening damn near every single night. And at 15 years old, Michelle finally decided that she would be safer on the streets and trying to fend for herself than she would be at home with her family. And this is when Michelle packed all of her few belongings, whatever clothes she could find that would fit, and whatever else pieces of scrap clothing that she could find laying around the house. She grabbed a small fleece blanket and threw it all into a small bag. And she ran away from her home, her family, and her abuser. Now, it's bad enough that Michelle had only taken whatever clothing she could find and a small fleece blanket with her when she ran away, but she'd also run away with no jacket, no coat, and nothing to stay warm with. But Michelle didn't forget to pack her art pencils, pencil sharpener, and her sketchbook, and whatever else she needed to fuel her artistic abilities. This was one thing that Michelle loved to do, was to draw, and she was good at it. So she didn't have a jacket or a coat or a blanket, but she had her few art supplies. Michelle later recalled how she'd felt safe for the first time in her entire life, and she only felt safe while she was living on the streets, with no house over her head and no car to sleep in, which has to say something about how her home life really was. If she felt safer on the streets, not knowing where she was going to sleep, how she was going to stay warm, and where her next meal was coming from, than she did at home with her parents and her family, that speaks volumes to me about what her home life was really like. Luckily, though, Michelle was tiny. And when I say she was tiny, I mean she was itty-bitty, teeny tiny. Michelle was about 4'6" and probably 100 pounds soaking wet. So she was small enough that she could lay in a trash can or a garbage can, like one of the big trash cans that the city picks up once a week. Yeah, she could lay one of those trash cans down on its side and then pull the lid to the top of it closed, and that's where Michelle would sleep a lot of nights. So that should give you some idea as to how small she is when I say tiny. Michelle was sleeping in trash cans, eating food from food banks, homeless shelters, and churches, and her life was so much better this way than it had been at home with her family. And I've said it once, and I'll probably say it again, but if this is a better option and a better situation for Michelle than being in whatever house her family was calling home at the time, that speaks volumes. It says a lot more than it should. Michelle eventually met a man who realized that she was homeless, and this man had introduced himself to Michelle as Sniper, and he told Michelle that he wanted to help her. So Sniper offered Michelle a room in his house, and the only thing he asked in return was for Michelle to run drugs for him occasionally, which, I mean, it's not a great situation, but it's definitely better than the situation that she was in with her family and the situation that she was in now being homeless. So, I mean, can't even really be mad at Michelle for jumping on this opportunity, because it was 1,000 times better than the way she had been living before. And as much as I assumed when I first started researching this, that Sniper was going to abuse Michelle and, do all these terrible things to her, he actually did not, which caught me by surprise for sure. Sniper ended up being so super sweet to Michelle. He never tried to sexually abuse her. He was extremely respectful to her privacy and even kind of protective of her. At one point, Sniper had given Michelle a small .22 caliber pistol to carry on her for protection from other people and to use for her protection while she was running drugs for him. So this isn't the worst situation that Michelle had ever been in, and from the way I understood it, Sniper seemed to treat Michelle like a younger sister, and like I said, he was kind of protective, super respectful, all the good things. Michelle actually felt safe with him, despite his name being Sniper. And Sniper did pay Michelle when she would run drugs for him. It wasn't something that she had to do every day, and he'd also rented her a room in his house for super cheap. So this was basically heaven compared to the way Michelle had been living for every other part of her life. So we're here for Sniper, and I don't care if he ran drugs or not. He made Michelle feel safe, and he didn't sexually abuse her, and I'm here for that part. But like most good things, Sniper's house did eventually get raided by the police. And luckily for Michelle, or maybe not so luckily for Michelle, depending on how you look at this part, but however you look at it, Michelle was able to get away without being caught in the drug raid at Sniper's house. And this raid, even though Michelle had somehow gotten away from the raid without being tied back to the drugs and crime, this raid had also ended the first safe place that Michelle had ever been able to call home. Because now she wasn't going to be able to go back to that house, and the friendships that she'd made had all come to an end. And I get it, they were drug dealers, but they also kind of took Michelle in and made her feel safe. So that has to kind of counter some of the bad that you think of when you think about a drug dealer and his name being Sniper and what he probably looks like. He really had been Michelle's saving grace, and now all of that was over. Michelle didn't really have much of a choice. After this raid on Sniper's house, she was kind of forced to go back to sleeping in trash cans and under overpasses. But shortly after Michelle found herself back on the streets and homeless again, someone would recognize her living on the streets, and whoever this person was that recognized Michelle, they'd ended up calling Michelle's dad to let him know that they had spotted Michelle and where they had seen her at. And that's about the time that Michelle's dad showed up, and he made Michelle go back to wherever the family was living at the time. So she had gotten away from Sniper's house during the drug raid, been forced into sleeping on the streets again, and then was spotted by a family member or family friend who called her dad, which in turn caused Michelle's dad to pick her up and take her right back to the hellhole that her family called home. And at this time, Michelle was still underage, so if she hadn't gone back with her dad, the police probably would have come and gotten involved and either forced her to go back home or possibly even put her in the system. So no option was a good option, and she ended up going back home with her dad. And of course, as you've probably all guessed, when Michelle was forced to go back home with her dad, things only got worse for Michelle from here. The family member that had been sexually abusing Michelle for all these years literally laughed in Michelle's face and told her that he thought it was hilarious that she thought that she was going to be able to get away from him that easily. So this family member was still living with Michelle's family, and he's literally laughing in her face, telling her that he thinks it's so funny that she thought she would be able to escape him and his abuse. The same night that Michelle was forced to go back home with her dad was the same night that the sexual abuse from the relative would start back up on Michelle. During a later interview, Michelle told ABC News, quote, "You name it, I went through it." And she's not exaggerating, not even in the slightest bit. When Michelle was 17 years old, she found out that she was pregnant by a boy that she had been dating. And Michelle learned that she was pregnant during her sophomore year of high school. But just as fate would have it, it turns out that Michelle's boyfriend had been seeing more than just Michelle, and when this guy was confronted with a choice of either Michelle, who's now pregnant with his baby, or this other girl that he'd been secretly dating, he chose the other girl despite Michelle being pregnant. And it wasn't until Michelle got pregnant that she finally started to try to fight off this relative that was always sexually abusing her. And according to Michelle in her book, Finding Me, sometimes fighting back actually worked. Michelle would eventually drop out of high school when she delivered her son, who she named Joey. Joey was born on October 24th in 1999, and Michelle, like most moms, wanted to give her son a better life than the one that she was given. And I feel like even if you had a great childhood and life, when you become a mom, you still want your kids to have more than you had for whatever reason. I mean, you just want to give your child the best possible life. Most parents do, and most of the time that's all parents really want, is to give their kid a better life. Even if your life wasn't horrible, you still want more, you still want better for your own kids. But Michelle wanted to give Joey a better life than the one she had, and she wanted that more than anything else she'd ever wanted in her entire life. She wanted to break the cycle of abuse, never let her son go without food, stable housing, hot showers, and a warm bed. She wanted to unlearn every cycle of abuse that she'd always had to live with. She wanted to give Joey the kind of life that she could look back on and be proud of. Michelle said in her book, Finding Me, that she loved Joey in a way that she had never been loved by anyone before. That she felt a love for Joey that was greater than any love she'd ever felt by anyone. Michelle says that the birth of her son Joey was what solidified her faith in God. Michelle had always been on the fence about God and religion before this, but she says that God was the only way that she could explain how she'd gotten such a perfect gift when she'd given birth to Joey. Michelle says that she believes that Joey was God's way of apologizing to her for all the things that she had already gone through and already had to endure in her short 18 years of life. Michelle's parents had decided to separate, and after their separation, Michelle's mom started seeing a man by the name of Carlos. And I don't think that this man's name is actually Carlos. I think this is like a pseudonym that Michelle gave him to be able to write about him in her book. I think that Michelle changed a lot of names in her book so that she could write about her experiences more freely. So Michelle's mom is dating Carlos now, and Carlos would eventually move in to Michelle's house with her and her mom and her 2 younger twin brothers. And of course, whatever other family members were couch surfing and living there temporarily. And as we'll find out later, Carlos was also an abusive drunk, but we'll get there. So when Joey was about 2 years old, Michelle had started job hunting, and she had started during the spring months. Michelle had just kind of decided that she was done, that she didn't want to live off of welfare, and she didn't want to live off of Social Security checks, that she wanted to be able to give Joey more than that. And that's when her job hunt began. So oftentimes Michelle would ask her mom to babysit Joey so that she could go fill out job applications. And this day was no different. Michelle had asked her mom to keep Joey, and of course her mom agreed. Michelle had filled out job applications at every fast food restaurant within a walking distance of her house. Michelle said that she was turned down for a lot of these jobs, even at fast food restaurants, because she was only 4'6" tall, and she wasn't even able to fill up the ice maker, or even able to reach some of the ingredients that sat, 5 foot or higher off the ground, even on the assembly line at some of these restaurants. And Michelle wasn't being picky. She said she would have taken any job doing damn near anything. And Michelle hadn't given up. She did this job hunt repeatedly. But by the summer of that year, Michelle still hadn't been able to find a job, but she had no plans of stopping until she found a job. Any job. And one day in early June, Michelle had come in at about 4 p.m., and she had come in from filling out, different job applications. And she was just kind of walking around the house looking for Joey, and when Michelle walks up the stairs to the bedroom, she saw that Carlos was the only one in the house with Joey, even though Michelle's mom was the one that was supposed to be watching Joey while Michelle had gone out job hunting. And when Michelle saw Carlos sitting on the edge of the bed in one of the upstairs bedrooms, Carlos was clearly and obviously super drunk. He was slurring his words, and you could smell the alcohol radiating off of him. And when Joey spotted Michelle, he ran up to her, and he was just mortified. Joey was so scared when he ran up to Michelle that he was actually urinating on himself while he tried to climb Michelle's body to get to her. Joey was clearly in pain, and Carlos let her know that he had grabbed Joey by the leg. And what Michelle would learn once she got Joey to the hospital is that when Carlos grabbed Joey by the leg, that he'd fractured 2-year-old Joey's knee. But Michelle didn't learn about this fracture until later. So at the time, when she had just gotten home and she saw that Joey was clearly in pain, she knew that she would have to take Joey to the hospital because he obviously needed medical care. But Michelle was scared to tell doctors and nurses at the hospital the truth about what had happened, because she knew that if she told them that her mom's boyfriend had gotten super drunk and grabbed Joey by the leg, that even though Michelle wasn't home at the time, and even though Carlos wasn't the one that was supposed to be keeping Joey, that the hospital would likely call Child Protective Services, and that CPS would probably open a case against her. And she's probably right. Michelle knew that if the hospital staff didn't feel like Joey was safe at home with her, then they could remove Joey from her care altogether. So instead, Michelle told the hospital staff that Joey had fallen at the park and hurt his leg. But these are trained medical professionals, and they can easily tell the difference between a fall at the park and abuse. So naturally, the hospital staff weren't really convinced that all of this was from a simple fall at a park on a playground. And CPS did come in to talk to Michelle at the hospital while Joey was being attended to by doctors and nurses. And as soon as Michelle saw the social workers, she knew what was happening, and she says that she knew what was happening before the social worker ever opened their mouth. Michelle even asked the social worker as soon as they approached her if they were going to take Joey from her. Now, the CPS social worker told Michelle that they actually knew exactly how Joey had gotten injured. And I'm sure Michelle was confused. And that's when the social worker told Michelle that Carlos had actually called the hospital and told him that he was the one that had injured Joey. So clearly, the hospital staff and the social worker could obviously tell by the way that Joey was acting towards Michelle that he wasn't in danger with her, per se. That Michelle wasn't the problem. And I don't think that they thought that Michelle would ever intentionally hurt or harm Joey. But they also couldn't allow Michelle to take Joey back to a house where something like this may happen again, because Carlos lived in the same house with Michelle and Joey. So even though they didn't believe that Michelle was the problem, they also couldn't let her take Joey back home to a potentially dangerous situation. And Joey was removed from Michelle's care in the hospital. And shortly afterwards, Michelle was notified that when Joey was released from the hospital, that he would be taken straight from the hospital and placed into the foster care system. Michelle, of course, sobs and pleads and begs hospital staff not to take her baby. And one of the social workers told Michelle that she could stay in the hospital room with Joey until the next day when he would be discharged and released from the hospital to be put into foster care. And that's what Michelle did. And all night, Michelle says that she just tried to think of how to explain to a 2-year-old that he was going to be going to live with complete strangers and that he wouldn't get to see Mommy for a while. So she says instead of trying to explain it, that she just snuggled with Joey and told him that Mommy was going to go away for a while, that when she got back, she would come to get him, which is probably the simplest and easiest way that I could think of to explain to a 2-year-old to where they could understand that also. So I completely agree with how she handled that. I don't think there's another way that a 2-year-old would understand it. So the next morning, Michelle put on her bravest face and she colored with Joey and she snuggled with Joey all morning until police officers arrived and told Michelle that it was time for them to say their goodbyes. And Michelle did her best to fight back tears as she hugged Joey, and she told him how much she loved him and she kissed him on the forehead. Meanwhile, Joey's starting to realize that these complete strangers are trying to pull him away from his mom. So Joey starts crying and begging his mommy not to leave him. And I'm sure that this would completely break any parent, and especially a parent who's just trying to better their life for their kids. Michelle asked in her book, Finding Me, quote, "How do you say goodbye to a child that once lived in your body?" And I don't have a good answer for that. As a mom, I can only speculate on the fact that having Joey was probably one of the best days in Michelle's life, and that the day that CPS pulled Joey from her arms, that was probably the worst day of her life. And again, that's just me speculating as a mom. Now, 3 days after Joey was taken from Michelle, she was given a court date for a hearing, and she ended up having to walk to this hearing, which took her over 3 hours. And when she got there, she was 15 minutes late. And this is about the time that the judge told Michelle that every time she was late and every single thing that she did wrong would be used as if it were ammo against her in the case with Joey, which is crazy to me. This was probably about a 20-minute hearing, and Michelle had walked over 3 hours to get there. She cared enough to walk to court to make sure that she made it. And Michelle would learn over the next few meetings what she was going to need to do in order to be deemed, quote-unquote, a fit mother again, which kind of pisses me off because she asked her mom to babysit Joey so that she could go find a job, so that she could get Joey out of that house and out of that situation. And her mom's the one that left Joey with Carlos. But here we are with Michelle having to prove herself to complete strangers in order to get Joey back. Michelle wasn't a bad parent. That's the thing. Michelle was a really good parent in a really shitty situation. And she was trying to get him out of this situation. She was trying to get both of them out of this situation, which is what a good parent would do. Michelle was told that she would have to get a job, which she was already trying to do. She was told that she would also have to find her own place, and that this new apartment, house, or whatever would have to be inspected and be deemed safe by a CPS social worker. But Michelle was granted supervised visitations with Joey once every 2 weeks or so until she could get all these things done. And at these supervised visitations, Michelle would be expected to show up on time, and in the meantime, she was supposed to start working on, fixing all of these things that CPS had listed out that she needed to do in order to get Joey back into her custody. So that's exactly what Michelle did. She moved out of her mom's house, where Carlo was also still living, and Michelle moved in with a cousin of hers by the name of Lisa. Michelle's cousin Lisa had agreed to rent Michelle an empty bedroom that she had for just $300 a month, which is a steal, a super cheap room, and it was probably a lot cleaner and a lot safer than what Michelle's mom's house was like. And even though Michelle still hadn't been able to find a job, her cousin Lisa had already let Michelle move in. So now Michelle's focus was on not only getting Joey back, but making sure that she had a roof over their head that would be deemed okay by CPS standards. She was also still trying to find a job in order to be able to pay this $300 a month rent to her cousin Lisa, who had offered her the empty room. But being out looking for a job is what had gotten her into this mess in the first place. She had gone out job hunting and left Joey with her mom. Her mom left Joey with Carlos, and now Michelle is back at square one. Except this time without her son Joey by her side. But Michelle was more focused on just getting into a house that would be deemed safe for Joey to come home to. And she would figure out the job thing as she went. Just like every other parent. At one point or another, we're all just winging it. And right now, Michelle is totally winging it. She figured she already had the room and it would be safe enough for CPS. So now she just needed to worry about a job and how to pay the rent. Again, she's winging it. One thing at a time, people. One thing at a time. And since Michelle wasn't really familiar with the area that she was living in with her cousin Lisa, her other cousin Deanna had agreed to kind of show Michelle around. Deanna only lived a few blocks from where Michelle was living now with their other cousin Lisa, so this would be perfect. Deanna could show Michelle around, and Michelle would be able to figure out where she could fill out job applications that would all be within a walking distance of her new living situation. And all of this was happening somewhere around June of 2002. Michelle and Deanna were sitting on the front steps of the house when Deanna introduced Michelle to a classmate of hers. Deanna introduced this classmate to Michelle as Ariel Castro. Emily had come over and hung out with Michelle and Deanna on a few different occasions after this first initial introduction. And Michelle later said about Emily that she really liked Emily, that she had always come off as a sweet person, and from the short time that the two girls spent together, that Michelle really thought she was super sweet and she really liked her. But Michelle did later recall that Emily had told her once while they were all hanging out that her parents were splitting up and that Emily's dad lived pretty close by on Seymour Avenue. Emily had even shown Michelle a picture of her dad and told her that his name was Ariel. But Emily would often refer to her dad as AC, and she'd even told Michelle at one point that her dad Ariel was a bus driver for the schools close by in the area. And Michelle had never actually met Emily's dad, but she had seen pictures of him, and she had heard Emily and him on the phone with each other before plenty of times. So you know how sometimes you're around someone who talks about someone else so much and so often that you kind of feel like you know them, even if you've never actually met them? That was kind of the situation here. Michelle had never met her friend Emily's dad, but she kind of felt like she knew him. Now, Michelle was still making sure to make it to each and every supervised visitation with her son Joey, but because he hadn't been placed in a more permanent foster home yet, Michelle was constantly going from this house to this house to the next house for her visits with Joey. Because when a child is in the custody of a state, they can move them as often as they need to, and they can place them damn near anywhere within the county that they work in. So sometimes these foster homes would be super out of the way and super far from Michelle, especially with no car, but somehow she always made it. She always made sure she was at those visitations, no matter how long it took her to get there walking. And sometimes it would take Michelle hours and hours and hours to get to a foster home that Joey had been moved to, and she didn't have a car, and oftentimes she didn't have a ride. But she's a mom, and she was doing the damn thing. She made it to every single visit up until the end of July. And 21-year-old Michelle was scheduled for her next meeting about the custody of Joey on August 23rd, 2002. This was the meeting where the state was supposed to be talking to Michelle about how and when she was supposed to be getting her son Joey back. It was absolutely not an option for Michelle to miss this meeting. This was easily the most important meeting with CPS that Michelle had had so far. But when Michelle's caseworker sent her the address to the place where the meeting would be, Michelle had absolutely no idea where this building was. Because remember, Michelle had just recently moved in with her cousin Lisa, and she wasn't really familiar with downtown Cleveland. And social services had offered to come and pick Michelle up and take her to this meeting, because they knew that she didn't have a car, and that she wouldn't be able to just drive around the day before to figure out where she needed to be. But Michelle had already lined it up with a family member, and they were supposed to be taking her to this meeting in their car. So she just kind of told the social worker, like, no thank you, but I have a ride to this meeting already, whatever. And as luck would have it, this family member that was supposed to be driving Michelle to this meeting with CPS bailed on giving her a ride, and they waited until the day of the meeting to tell Michelle that they wouldn't be able to take her. Go figure. So Michelle asked her cousin Deanna if she wanted to walk with her to try to figure out where the social services office was. And of course, Deanna agreed to walk with Michelle. Michelle and Deanna left at around 11 a.m. and Michelle didn't have to be at the social services office until about 2:30 p.m. So they left in plenty of time to get lost and then find the place and still make it on time. And Michelle and her cousin Deanna walked for hours and hours trying to find this building where Michelle was supposed to be meeting with the social services about getting custody of Joey back. And Michelle and Deanna had been walking for what seemed like forever when Michelle told Deanna to go ahead and head back home, that she would figure it out and, she would talk to her later. Deanna had already been walking around with Michelle for hours. It was hot outside and this was something that Michelle had to do, so Deanna did. She headed back home. And Michelle tried using a payphone to call the social services office to tell them that she may be late. But whoever Michelle talked to basically just told her that she should have taken the ride that they offered her. Before Michelle even had a chance to explain that her ride had bailed on her last minute, and before Michelle even had time to ask for more detailed directions, she was hung up on. Which, this sounds like a real asshole move. Sorry, not sorry. At about 2:30 p.m., Michelle finally walked into a Family Dollar store to ask for directions. Now, mind you, Michelle was supposed to be at this meeting with her social worker and CPS at 2:30. So she's already late at this point because she's walking into Family Dollar at 2:30 when she's supposed to be at this meeting at 2:30. But not showing up was also not an option. Michelle was kind of familiar with this dollar store, though, because this was the same Family Dollar where she had gotten most of Joey's Christmas gifts the previous Christmas. Michelle asked everyone she ran into in this dollar store for directions, and no one seemed to be able to point her in the right way. She'd asked the cashiers, customers, literally everybody. She was overheated, she was dehydrated, she'd been walking all day long, she was stressed, and now she was late to the most important meeting of her life. Michelle was feeling kind of defeated, and she was in tears, and she was just kind of ready to give up completely. She had even kind of started to accept the fact that she may not make it to this meeting at all. But she also knew how social services would react to her being late, and also how they would react to her not showing up at all. And she knew it wouldn't be good for her either way. Michelle had been in and out of the system for her entire life. She knew that no one cared that her ride had bailed on her. She knew that no one cared that she'd walked for hours and just been lost, and she knew that no one cared that she had been trying to find the building all day long. She knew that nothing she could say would be able to help her situation. She knew how the system worked. Michelle was just about to walk back out of the Family Dollar when she heard a voice that she thought she recognized. When Michelle turned around, she realized who the voice belonged to. It was Ariel Castro, her friend Emily's dad. And Michelle breathed a sigh of relief when Ariel told her that he knew exactly where that building was located. And since Michelle knew Emily Castro and was friends with her, and because she had already heard Emily talk to her dad on the phone 100 times before, Michelle finally was like, well, thank God someone knows where I need to be. And Emily had shown Michelle pictures of her dad before. This was, for sure, Emily's dad. And that was what initially made Michelle lower her guard for him in the first place. Michelle told Ariel that she was friends with his daughter Emily, and Ariel said something along the lines of, oh yeah, I know. So Michelle said that while she was talking to Ariel, his voice was gentle, and he seemed kind of trustworthy, and even kind. But he seemed trustworthy for more than one reason. He was her friend's dad, and she felt like she knew him and like she could trust him. Ariel tells Michelle to let him pay for his things and that he would give her a lift to the social services office. And of course, Michelle sighs the biggest sigh of relief that she may actually make it to this appointment after all. She would be late, but she would at least be there. Michelle looked at Ariel as his things were being rang up and as he was paying for his items, and she first noticed his potbelly stomach, his dry, cracked, dirty hands, his filthy pants, grease-stained shirt, and unwashed hair. But this was her friend Emily's dad, and he had agreed to drive her. So she should be fine, right? Ariel collected his change from his purchase, and he and Michelle walked out of the Family Dollar store into the parking lot. And the first weird thing that happened was that Ariel was kind of holding Michelle's upper arm while the two walked through the parking lot together. And he was kind of holding her arm in a way that a younger man would hold the arm of like an elderly lady while he helped her cross the street. Or maybe in the same way that I would hold my kid's arm in the parking lot to keep them from running into a car that is heading straight for them. But she overlooked that small arm holding, even though Ariel was holding her arm pretty tightly. And Michelle says that she could smell the smell of transmission fluid radiating off of Ariel as they walked together. But when he noticed Michelle's face, probably realizing that he was holding her arm and it was making her uncomfortable, he immediately let her arm go. And Michelle said later in her book that at that moment, that exact moment, when he let her arm go, that in the pit of her stomach, she felt like a jolt. But he had let her arm go, and this was her friend's dad, so she ignored her gut intuition. Never do that. Always trust your gut. It's always right. But, as we'll soon learn, things weren't going to be fine, and things for Michelle wouldn't be fine for a very long time after this. Michelle said that she felt like she could trust Ariel more than a random, regular stranger, even though she didn't actually know him, and even though she had never actually met him until that very moment, but she felt like she should be able to trust him simply because he was Emily's dad. And with the cards that Michelle had already been dealt in life, the fact that she was able to trust a single solitary soul seriously impresses me. Y'all may be able to hear the rain coming. We are expecting a hurricane this evening or early in the morning. So we're gonna keep going through the rain, and I'm sorry about the noise. So Ariel waves Michelle over to his 4-door orangish-colored vehicle that was parked in the parking lot of that Family Dollar store, and they walked towards his car. Ariel let Michelle get in the car first, and he walked around to the driver's side of the vehicle. While Michelle was waiting for Ariel to get into the driver's seat, and while he was walking around the other side of the car, she noticed that his car was filled with McDonald's food wrappers, takeout containers from different Chinese restaurants in the area, snack food packages and wrappers, and the trash wasn't just in the floor of his car. It was on the floor, on the dash where the front window was, and even shoved down into the small compartments on the car doors on the inside. Trash filled this vehicle so much so that Michelle jokingly asked Ariel if he lived in this vehicle, and he laughed before he pulled the vehicle out of the parking lot. Michelle also noticed that the knobs that you would use to roll the front and back windows up and down in the car, those knobs were missing, which was weird, but Ariel and Michelle pulled out of the parking lot, and as they were driving, Ariel kind of jerked the steering wheel of the car super hard to one side, kind of in a way that seemed like he was messing with Michelle. And Michelle didn't even really think much about this little steering wheel stunt either, though, because she had remembered plenty of times that her friend Emily had been on the phone with Ariel, and he would do all sorts of things to try to make the girls laugh. Ariel would reportedly do like a hillbilly or deep southern accent to make the girls laugh, and to that I say, he was probably trying to make himself sound like, well, me. But he would do these kinds of things all the time to try to make his daughter Emily and any of her friends that were around, he was just trying to make them all laugh. So Michelle just kind of assumed that by him jerking the steering wheel to one side pretty hard, that this was probably just his way of trying to make her laugh. And Michelle was probably thinking that this was Ariel's version of a dad joke. That's just me speculating, but it makes sense. But when Ariel jerked the wheel, he noticed that Michelle's face looked more worried than she had looked before. So he told Michelle not to worry, and he told her that he joked around like this with his kids all the time, which Michelle knew was true because she had heard Ariel on the phone with his kids before, and he was always goofing off and trying to make them laugh. So to Michelle, this seemed like a logical reason for Ariel to jerk the steering wheel like that. The two continued riding down the road together, and Michelle was explaining to Ariel about her open CPS case and about how this meeting was so important for her to get to, and just basically giving him a quick rundown of the situation that she was currently in. Michelle explained that even though she knew that she would be late for this meeting, she still felt like it was important for her to be there and to at least show up. And the whole time that Michelle was talking, Ariel seemed to be empathetic to her story, and he seemed to be actually listening to her. But one weird thing was that Michelle had broken her eyeglasses sometime shortly before this day. But even with broken glasses, she could tell that they weren't driving in the right direction. Ariel had told Michelle while they were both still inside of the dollar store something like, "Oh yeah, I think where you need to be is just right over there," and pointed to one direction. But then when they pulled out of the parking lot of the store, they pulled out in the opposite direction of the way that Ariel had pointed to when he was telling Michelle that he knew where she was trying to get to. And Michelle brought this up to Ariel, and when she did, he assured her that it was fine, that he just needed to grab something really quick from his house, and he even told her that Emily would be home from school when they got there. And then Ariel even told Michelle after her meeting with CPS that he would give her and Emily some money and take the two and drop them off at the mall, and they would be able to shop together or walk around the mall, get some food, whatever else they wanted to do. But he did make sure to tell Michelle that he would make sure that she made it to her meeting with CPS before they worried about the mall and shopping. So Michelle was a little nervous about this, but she was grateful for the ride, and she didn't want to be rude to her friend's dad. And she probably even thought that a trip to the mall and a hot meal with a good friend sounded nice. So she told him that was fine, but asked if they could make the stop by his house quick so that she could get to the meeting with CPS. And the clock on the dash of Ariel's car read 3:00 p.m. So Michelle knew that Emily would be getting home from school right as she and Ariel got to the house. But what Michelle didn't know was that Emily didn't actually live with her dad, and that Emily only ever visited with her dad every once in a while. And it turns out Emily didn't visit with Ariel very often at all, actually. So Ariel is telling Michelle that he just has to run into the house, grab something super quickly, and that she and Emily could go to the mall and hang out afterwards. But while they're driving, Ariel asked Michelle if she likes puppies, and of course she said yes, because who doesn't love puppies? Michelle goes on to tell Ariel about how Joey loves puppies because, duh, all kids love puppies too. And she tells him how Joey goes crazy every time he sees a puppy, and this is when Ariel tells Michelle that his dog had recently had a litter of puppies, and that if she wanted to pick one out that she could, and that she would be able to give it to her son Joey as a gift when she was able to bring him back home. So now Michelle's like super excited about this puppy and about being able to give this puppy to Joey. So Michelle's just kind of thinking about how generous Ariel has been to her so far. He'd already given her a ride when no one else would even help with directions, and now he's saying he's going to give her a puppy to be able to give to her son Joey, and he's offered to give her and Emily money to go to the mall and hang out after her meeting with CPS. She actually felt like she was thankful that she'd ran into her friend Emily's dad on that particular day in that particular dollar store. And besides that, Michelle just knew that Joey would absolutely lose his mind when she gave him a brand new puppy after she was able to bring him home to a place that was clean and safe. This would be perfect timing for everything in Michelle's life to fall right back into place where she wanted it. But unfortunately, nothing good was going to come out of this ride that she'd gotten from Ariel. Michelle and Ariel eventually pulled into the driveway of a white 2-story house on Seymour Avenue. And this house is where Ariel lived, and it was actually only a few blocks away from the place that Michelle had recently moved into with her cousin Lisa. So she felt a little bit better about at least being somewhat familiar with the area. Michelle at least knew that she had walked past this house 100 times before. And then she noticed a huge chain link fence with grass that, was about knee high. And all around the fence and inside was just really tall grass. Then Michelle noticed that the yard was also littered with just as many fast food containers and snack wrappers as what she'd noticed in Ariel's vehicle. So, needless to say, the yard was also covered in trash wrappers and empty food containers. Michelle had just started to put it together that she and Ariel had driven for somewhere around 7 or 8 miles in order to get to Ariel's house since they had left the dollar store together. But since Michelle only lived a few blocks over from Seymour Avenue, where Ariel's house was located, she started realizing that she knew it should have only taken them about 2 to 3 minutes to drive from that dollar store to Seymour Avenue where they are now. It shouldn't have taken them 7 or 8 miles to drive from that dollar store to get to Seymour Avenue where his house was. So, had he driven them in circles? Or why had he driven them, around 4 times longer than he needed to just to get back to the same house? And something else to remember during this part of the story is the fact that Ariel's a school bus driver. So surely to God he would know the fastest route to get to nearly anywhere in this area. So why would he have made a 2-minute drive turn into a 7 or 8 mile ride? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Unless he had done it intentionally. Once Michelle and Ariel had made it into the driveway of Ariel's house, Michelle took note of the fact that Ariel had gotten out of his vehicle to unlock one of the locks that was attached to the fence. And once Ariel had gotten the fence unlocked, he got back into the vehicle and pulled the car further into the driveway, and then got back out to lock the fence again. And then he pulled his car even further into the now locked fence. And this kind of made Michelle nervous, too, because he was just supposed to be grabbing something out of his house really quickly, and then they were supposed to be leaving, so that he could take Michelle to this meeting with CPS. So why would he secure the lock on the fence if they were leaving right back out to go to her meeting? And Michelle asked him about this. She basically just asked, hey, why would you unlock the fence, pour your car further into the gated backyard, and then lock the lock on the fence back if we're supposed to be leaving any second to go to my meeting? And of course, Ariel had an excuse for this too, and he basically just explained that they lived in a rough part of the neighborhood, and that he was always worried about his vehicle being stolen from his driveway or his yard, and Michelle just kind of says oh, okay, because again, she doesn't want to be rude to someone who's not only her friend's dad, but also she doesn't want to be rude to someone who's helping her. He doesn't have to help her. He doesn't have to give her a ride. And even without the ride, she still doesn't know where this building is that he claims to know exactly where it is. So she's trying to be polite. And then Michelle noticed a dog that was chained up on the outside of the house, and it was a chow. And Ariel explained that this chow was named Maxine, and that this was the dog that had just given birth to the litter of puppies recently. And Michelle asked why he would have her chained up outside when she should probably be inside with her new litter of puppies. And Ariel explained that sometimes Maxine peed in the house and that sometimes he chained her up outside for short lengths of time so that she could use the bathroom. So that she didn't use the bathroom inside the house. Ariel then asked Michelle if she wanted to go inside and pick which puppy she wanted to keep and take home. And Michelle was kind of hesitant about going inside of a stranger's house, but then Ariel told Michelle not to worry because Emily was already home from school and that she was already inside the house. So Michelle was just like, oh, okay, so Emily's already home and she's already inside, so it'll be fine. Michelle figured that it would only take her a minute to check out the puppies, pick which one she wanted to give to Joey, and it would only take a second. But this short period of time would be a short time frame that Michelle would likely regret forever. Michelle started to walk inside of Ariel's house when she noticed a neighbor outside that she actually recognized from the neighborhood. So Michelle smiled and waved at the neighbor with the familiar face. Michelle had to walk basically anywhere that she needed to go, so she got pretty familiar with the faces at every house that she walked by pretty frequently. She smiled and waved at the neighbor who she recognized before turning to go inside of Ariel's house to check out the puppies. And Michelle later said that just by simply waving at the neighbor outside, that made her feel more comfortable about going inside of Ariel's house, that at least she knew that someone had seen her going inside of the house. And with how friendly Ariel had been with the same neighbor that she had waved at, and with Emily supposedly have already gotten home from school, Michelle kind of started feeling like maybe she was overreacting. That maybe she was making a mountain out of a molehill and maybe this was all nothing. Once Michelle and Ariel both walked inside, Michelle noticed that the house was covered with just as much, if not more trash, than she'd seen in his vehicle and in his yard. Michelle even remembered thinking that the vehicle that she had just rode in to get here was kind of clean compared to the way the inside of the house looked. There were dishes that were dirty and covered in hard, crusted-on, stuck-on foods. Empty takeout containers were sitting everywhere. Empty beer bottles were scattered all over the house. There was just trash everywhere. The house was completely disgusting, but the smell was foul. Michelle said that the house smelled of rotten black beans, human urine, and stale beer, which sounds absolutely disgusting. And then Michelle noticed that all of the windows inside of the house were all boarded up from the inside. Like, not in a normal way that windows are normally locked from the inside. It wasn't like that. It was pieces of plywood or like slabs of thin wood sheeting that had been placed over the windows from the inside of the house. And then these boards had been screwed up to keep it where you can't see inside the house. And I'm just going to give y'all this little nugget of knowledge. Don't go in anyone's house if you don't know them. And I mean, like, unless you really, really know them. And also, don't go in houses if you see that the windows are boarded up. That's not normal. You don't need plywood on the inside of your windows in Cleveland. We're about to board our house up, but for a whole different reason. When the hurricane comes and hits, it's done, we'll take them down. What he's got is not normal. When Michelle saw a picture of Emily on one of the countertops, she asked Ariel where Emily was, since she was supposed to have been home from school already. And Ariel told her that she was just right downstairs throwing a load of laundry in the washing machine. Ariel tells Michelle that she can head upstairs with him if she wants to, so that they can go ahead and pick whichever puppy she likes. And Michelle just kind of politely declines the offer. But this is when Ariel reminds Michelle that there's no reason to be afraid of him, because duh, he's Emily's dad. So even though Michelle was reluctant, she did eventually agree to go upstairs and look at the puppies with him. And Michelle remembers that Ariel seemed to be sincere while he was talking to her. So sincere that she didn't really think twice once they headed up the stairs together. As they were going up the steps, though, something that Michelle did notice right away was that she didn't hear any whimpering or whining like you would expect to hear with an entire litter of healthy puppies. So Michelle asked Ariel about that as they were heading up the steps that led to the top floor of the house. And Ariel just told her that the puppies were still in the stage where they slept most of the day and they didn't really make a lot of noise yet. Which, this makes sense because Ariel had kind of hinted around to the fact that the puppies wouldn't be ready to go to a new owner until about the same time that she had hopes of getting Joey back. Once Michelle and Ariel got upstairs, Ariel led Michelle into a brightly painted pink room, where he pointed to a dresser. Ariel told Michelle that the puppies were right under that dresser that he'd pointed at, which is weird all by itself. Why are newly born puppies underneath a dresser? So, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So, these puppies are supposedly either inside or under the dresser that he's pointing at. But when Michelle bent down to look, she heard a loud-ass noise. And when she turned back around to see what the noise had been, she saw that he had slammed the door to the bright pink room that they had just walked into together, shutting and locking it with both of them inside together. Michelle begged and pleaded, telling Ariel that she absolutely had to make this meeting with CPS in order to get Joey back. And that's when Ariel used one of his gross, disgusting, dirty-ass hands to cover Michelle's mouth and nose. And he then used his other free hand to grab the back of Michelle's head. The man that Michelle was looking at now was not the same goofy, funny, loving guy that she'd heard her friend Emily talk to. Ariel shoved Michelle to the ground, and Michelle just closed her eyes because, sadly, she was all too familiar with what was about to happen next. She was even kind of used to this. Michelle knew what was coming, and she knew how the whole thing was going to go down. Ariel screamed at Michelle, telling her not to move as she lay on the floor. He then threw her purse to one corner of the room that they were in. Michelle stayed on the floor where he had laid her down as he threw her purse and all of the things in her purse and belongings around. And even though Michelle could hear Ariel rummaging through the things in her purse, she was still completely in shock and too terrified to move. Ariel walked out of the room for just a second, and he came back into the bright pink room carrying a stool and 2 orange extension cords. Michelle tried to stand up, but Ariel just shoved her back down onto the ground and ordered her to lay down and to be still. Ariel sat down on the stool that he had just brought into the room, and after he sat on the stool, he wrapped the orange extension cords around Michelle's ankles, and he'd wrapped them so hard and so tightly around her ankles that they were actually cutting into her skin. They were so tightly tied around her ankles that it had caused her feet to go completely numb almost instantly. So both of her feet and her ankles are now tied together, before he then tied both of her wrists behind her back. Once he had both of her wrists tied to each other and both of her ankles tied to each other, he then pulled her ankles up to where her hands were and tied all 4 of them together, essentially hog-tying her wrists and ankles together behind her back. Ariel then took the extension cord and wrapped it around her neck, and the entire time that he's tying her up and moving and jerking her body and limbs in different directions, he wasn't saying anything at all. It was just complete silence while someone you thought you could trust is hog-tying you in an upstairs bedroom of a house that you thought you'd be safe in. This must have been completely mortifying for Michelle. And now she's laying, hog-tied and helpless in this dirty-ass floor that Michelle would just later refer to as the pink room. Ariel stood up and pulled his pants down, revealing that he had no underwear on. He pulled his penis out and started masturbating himself while he stared into Michelle's eyes. Michelle said later that his eyes were completely blank. No emotion, no empathy, just heartless, blank eyes, void of any kind of human emotion. And while all of this is going on, he's telling Michelle that she would only need to stay there with him for a little while. But Michelle noticed that the more that he talked, the more aggressively that he was stroking himself. Ariel was just screaming at Michelle, telling her that his wife and kids had all just left him, and Michelle's feet were starting to get cold from where they were so numb. She had snot running down her face, and she just felt this sensation wash over her that told her that she was about to die. While Michelle was staring out of the window of the pink room, she started wondering to herself why these types of things always seemed to happen to her. But before she could even finish the thought, Ariel interrupts her thinking as he ejaculates onto her shorts. And as he's doing this, he's screaming out the word yes, and she said that he looked very much wild-eyed and possessed. Once Ariel was finished, he kind of rested his head against one of the walls of the pink room while he tried to slow his breathing and catch his breath. His pants had fallen completely off of his hips and were laying around his ankles now. He adjusts himself and then tells Michelle to be quiet and to be still so that he can tie her up. Now, she's already laying on the floor of this nasty-ass room hogtied, so she's already tied up. Michelle laid in a puddle of her own tears and his semen, and she did just as he said. She lay there quietly, and she prayed to herself under her breath. When Ariel heard Michelle quietly praying to herself, he slapped her and told her that she had to be quiet. Ariel then used some really long, thick wire to hoist her body up into the air, and he'd managed to hoist her up about 12 inches or so off of the floor where she'd been laying. And before Michelle even realized what was happening, she was not only hogtied, but hogtied and hanging from 2 metal poles that seemed to work something like a pulley system. So now Michelle's body is hogtied and hanging from the middle of the ceiling. And all of Michelle's body weight is just pushed onto certain parts of her body, like her stomach, her chest, and her neck. Ariel then used a stiff, dirty sock and shoved it into Michelle's mouth using duct tape to secure the sock. And afterwards, he wrapped more duct tape around her head to keep it from being able to move. Michelle's thoughts quietly flashed back to the neighbor that she'd seen and waved at when she'd first come inside Ariel's house of horrors. And she hoped so badly that someone would hear what was going on, or at least notice when she didn't come back out of the house. Ariel yelled at Michelle not to scream and not to make any noise, which you would think that he would have realized that he had shoved a stiff, dirty sock into her mouth and that she probably couldn't make any noise even if she wanted to. So he told her not to make any noise and not to scream, and then he let Michelle know that he was going to go get some food, that he'd be back shortly. Ariel then grabbed a radio that was nearby, and he turned it up as loud as it would possibly go before he left Michelle hanging in the air with a sock in her mouth, hogtied and duct taped in place. And this is so much information and such emotional information that I think this is a good stopping point. This case is easily going to be as long as the Casey Anthony series, if not longer, just because I want to make sure to include all of the details, because there's a really good possibility that somebody's neighbor is doing this exact same thing. Think about that. I gotta go feed a baby, and I gotta go get kids, and I gotta go prep for a hurricane, y'all. So, let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.